Uh, we're so happy today to have military historian Mark Albertson, and really thank Yusuf for connecting us with Mark. And um, the we're catching a period of transition in Europe from feudalism to capitalism, and one of the triggers, and Mark correctly, I think, insisted on starting with this, was the 30 Years' War from 1618 to 1648. And the war reflected the deepening contradictions and crisis of feudal regimes in Europe, and the efforts by the young capitalist class to take control over the capitalist, over the state apparatus. And in the middle, or near the middle of the 30 Years' War, bourgeois revolution breaks out in England under the leadership of Cromwell. And I'm hoping Mark is able to touch on the new model army, which really struck me when I first read about it, because it was organized like no army had been before, with extraordinary consciousness by the peasants and workers who were at the heart of the army. And among them were the levelers and essentially early communists, reflecting very early communist consciousness. And their enthusiasm for ending feudalism was key to Cromwell's victory. But the young bourgeoisie, of course, couldn't put up with levelers or with peasants and workers armed and conscious, and the contradictions between Cromwell and his own army came up. Cromwell wanted to, at some point, compromise with the king, and the army wouldn't let him, and pushed to the end. But sure enough, Cromwell essentially then moved to regularize the army. But the second part, really, of the presentation, again letting Mark take it, is that in 1787, again, feudalism ran into trouble, in part from war after war and all of the debts that came with it. And in 1787, well, the king in France was trying to pay for the wars, and you could only extract so much from the peasants and young workers. And so he moved to try to raise taxes on his own social base, the aristocracy, and which went into rebellion. So this is 1787, and that opened the door for the start of a French Revolution, 1789, 2 years later, and the overthrow not only of a feudal monarchy but of the aristocracy. And this extraordinary development soon brought attacks from neighboring feudal powers, aided by a fearful conservative bourgeois capitalist England. Before that happened, again, because of the enthusiasm of the masses, essentially the young bourgeoisie had to put it down. And that's, in part, that's the 18th Brumaire and the rise of Napoleon. But France remained very much bourgeois, even as it suppressed its peasants and workers. And France soon comes under attack from feudal regimes, as I said, and England, and that sets the stage for the rise of Napoleon's armies and levee en masse, the mass conscriptions that made up the majority of Napoleon's armies. And they went victory after victory and then pushed too far. Last event we had, I mentioned growing up in Egypt. We'd go to the pyramids and the Sphinx, and only to find that to learn that the Sphinx's nose had been broken. Napoleon's armies had used it for target practice, and did that elsewhere. But in any case, there was a huge change in the organization of armies with Napoleon, and it can still be seen today. But in any event, welcome Mark Albertson and everyone. And I think we're in a similar period now of a great crisis of capitalism. And as in the past, crisis of the old systems can open the door for huge liberation. But it requires leadership and knowledge of history, as Mark is about to address.
Yeah, it's a good lead in, yes, and I'm still convinced that once you hit the 17th century, and by this point, the difference of opinion, let's put it that way, between Catholics and the upstart Protestants. I mean, the church, and I was once Catholic myself. In fact, I went to my reunion about 2 years ago, and I don't practice anymore. I haven't practiced Catholicism in a long time. And when I got there, I was assigned, you know how you are when you go to a reunion, you're assigned to a certain table and you're sitting with a certain group you graduated with, right? And goes, hey, my wife and I were among the last ones. Hey, here's Albertson. I said, yeah, it's nice being with a group of people who graduated from a Roman Catholic madrasa. Now, some of that went over real good with some people and some of it did not. So you can tell who stayed Catholic and who didn't. But the fact of the matter is the church is losing its grip, going into the 16th, 17th centuries. And even at this point, even monarchs are beginning to separate itself from the church. Recall going back centuries before, if you were becoming a monarch of a country, you had to be sponsored in part by the Pope. And that's being lost here at this point. Changes take place and they change over centuries. But don't be misled. The Catholic Church still owned a lot of land. You still have the Papal States. That hasn't died yet. But when you go back to the 30 Years' War and its savages, I mean, it destroys the center of Europe. We're talking a lot of this is the old German states. There's no Germany, but it's the German states. And the Habsburg realms are going to be savaged here. And it's estimated by some military historians that anywhere from 5 million to 8 million died here in this 30 Years' War. Now, they don't have modern weaponry like you see today. 5 million to 8 million people. Now, many of those who were peasants. You're still in that era where the armies are not overly large. The nobility or the officers, and usually knights and so on and so forth. But if you needed men for a line, what did you do? You told these serfs, okay, Stosh, drop the hoe and pick up the pike and join the line. Now, this is really not sophisticated here. This really isn't. But in a conflict like this that lasts for several decades, you lose a lot of peasants. Who's planting the crops, who's reaping the crops. And so what follows this massive extinction of humanity here? Starvation, famine. We can't have this anymore. So you were beginning to see here among the major powers of Europe, a move toward going back to how this was prior, having smaller armies. In other words, more of a professional army. And some even they did this in France, they'll do this in England, where yes, the nobility, the privileged set will remain the officer class, But how about getting the guys who are in debtor's prison? They're not paying their debts off in prison. So why don't we stick them in a military uniform and they can work off their debt? And that's where some of this is going to go. So you have and these guys are considered dregs of society. In fact, I got something and I found this interesting. And this is from actually from Frederick the Great. Troops are raised either by voluntary engagement or capitulation. That is a contract. Sometimes too by compulsion, but most commonly by artifice, such as that are of secretly putting money into a man's pocket and afterwards challenging him to be a soldier. The men were recruited largely from the dregs of society, and in consequence, discipline was ferocious. According to Frederick the Great, since honor meant nothing to them, they must be made to fear their officers more than danger, and that the slightest loosening of discipline would lead to barbarization. So the discipline is particularly brutal here for men who were just the common everyday rank and file. So you have this class difference between these armies. Now, interestingly enough, in the 1930s and going into the 40s in the German army, in training, especially prior to what we call the Second World War, there was a commonality here between the officers and the men. Keep in mind what World War I brings, this mass extinction of people that many of the nobilities originally were officers, but if they're dying in the trenches, who do you have to get to replace them as part of the officer class? Commoners. So now you're getting a greater degree of commonality between the private, the corporal, and the sergeant, and the lieutenant and the captain. And this led to a well-trained German army going into 1939. And that's something that should be acknowledged here. But you're seeing with this growth of levee en masse, virtually the extinction, and I'll use that term, extinction of nobility on a battlefield. If there's one way to get rid of them, apparently this is it. Capitalism. if you want to be brutal about it. But with the English Revolution, you are seeing something else happen, because what you're seeing here with and Lenin was right about this, industrialized war. That's what this is. It's industrialized, and it's going to become industrialized, corporatized, commercialized war by the 20th century. That's where this is going. But it takes a while to get here. But in the English Revolution, you are seeing, keep in mind, this is where the Industrial Revolution is snowballing, and it's only going to be a matter of time before it crosses the English Channel. But here you are seeing a fledgling working class, a fledgling middle class that's growing. And like later on in the French Revolution, this bourgeois class, and this is going to come up in the English Revolution, it's going to come up again in the French Revolution, where the bourgeoisie is going to profess, we are the ones earning our wealth. Much of the nobility is living on what? Inherited wealth. Since we are working for our wealth, we deserve a better deal. That's part of the argument here. And so they are going to take control of Parliament. Now, the king, yes, the king in England controls the church, the Anglican religion. He's the one that imparts the bishops, right? Imparts the Archbishop of Canterbury. And that's something that Tench Coxe brought up in the United States. After the Revolution, during the Constitutional Convention, he said, the man we want sitting at the head of the country, the president, is not going to appoint the leader of the religion. And if there's anything that intimates in this country the separation of church and state, that's it. And I don't hear that being brought up in these arguments about abortion, and then what that leads to, conflict of church and state. But here in England, in the 17th century, you are seeing here this separation of church and state, but also the rise of capitalism, which is going to be man's new secular religion. That's man's new secular religion. I mean, look at the United States today. Pete, you go to the polls and you vote for a Democrat or Republican. Washington is still the nominal capital. I profess that the capital of the United States is only 40 miles south of me. It's called Manhattan. They're the wallets. They run the country. And so Washington is not. And that's what seems to be growing here. Because understand something, you are seeing the growth of a company during this period that's known as the British East India Company. That was sanctioned by Queen Elizabeth in 1600. And that's the company that's actually going to run eventually the Indian colony. That's a corporate foreign policy. This is what you're seeing eventually coming out of the revolution. But as Wadi mentioned earlier, it's Oliver Cromwell who's going to put together, with assistance from people like Lord Fairfax, a professional style of army, where the officers will not necessarily be nobility, but professionals, even from the commoner class. This is a shadow of what you're going to see in the 20th century with Hitler's German army. And so the men, some peasants, some of the working class, some bourgeoisie who sign on to fight. This is the beginning of a professional army, not overseen by nobility. And it's based in part on what? In part, nationalism. You are seeing the future of Napoleon. It's going to be more pronounced in the 18th century. As nobility, you are seeing nobility and royalty even now on this slow decline to that mass extinction in 1918, 1919. Historical changes of note take a long period of time. They don't happen overnight. They don't happen in the blink of an eye. And it's the same thing what you're seeing here with the change in the military. Now, keep in mind, as this proceeds, this new model army is actually a picture of what you're going to see eventually in the United States during the American Civil War. You are seeing in Britain here in 1640, 1645, 1646, an army you are going to see in the United States in 1862, 63, and 64, and 65. That's over 2 centuries, but it's coming. Why? Because you've had, not after the English Revolution, when you get into the 18th century, most armies are still fairly small here. We are not in a global conflict. We're not in global conflicts yet. So there's no need for this mass conscription of entire populations. And for Britain has a small army, believe it or not. But unlike other armies in the world, they are highly mobile. The Royal Navy can carry these men wherever they need to be. They rule the seas. They don't need an overly huge army. Why? Because they rule the oceans. The Royal Navy, what does it rule? Britannia. Britannia rule the waves. It's the British Army, folks. But for the crown, it's my Navy. It's the British Army is not the Royal British Army. The Navy is the Royal Navy. That tells you what? The king controls the country. The king controls the Navy. However, in the American Revolution, one of the reasons the American Revolution succeeds, this country in its development, even though we were peopled by Europeans, this country skipped a stage in its development. Not so England, not so Spain, not so Portugal, not so the German states, not so France. I'm talking about feudalism / serfdom. We didn't have that here. True, Americans had slaves, but that's not feudalism, not the way we know feudalism. We skipped that stage. That's why the major reason the French Revolution will be so be so toxic, as will the Russian Civil War. There are commonalities between the French Revolution and the Russian Revolution, followed by the Civil War. There are a lot of commonality. And I give Marxists a lot of credit for spending a lot of time studying the French Revolution. Remember what Lenin once said before the First World War. If the proletarian revolution is going to succeed in Russia, it must acquaint itself and be allies of the peasant, because the peasant was 90% of the population. You know how he gets this from? He got this from oh, now his name just left me. That's nice. Maximilian Robespierre. Robespierre, as a lesser bourgeoisie, a cheap lawyer, that's what he was able to acclimate this fledgling working class with the peasantry. But being that he took control of the revolution at an inopportune time, he's going to go to the guillotine. But Lenin understood what he was doing, and Lenin will make it work. This fledgling working class in Russia, mating it up with the peasantry. It's the numbers that matter, because remember what Lenin once said: in quantity, there is a certain quality. That should not be forgotten. But here, there is no levee en masse. Why? Number one, America's 3,000 miles from Europe. And the British, at the same time they're sending troops here, are now sending them into the Middle East. The British are spread. France, it will be a different story. The revolution starts in 1789. And in 1789, the French are like Americans fighting a single crown. Louis XVI, the Bourbons. And they are going to undermine the Bourbons. However, here, the French, unlike us, are in the belly of the beast. What's next to France, depending on which border you're looking at? The Carlists in Spain, the Hanovers in England, the Habsburgs, Austria, the Hohenzollerns, Prussia, the Romanovs, Russia. They're not stupid. They see these ideas being unleashed in France as they were in the United States. The idea of America, the ideas of the age of reason, age of enlightenment, liberalism, democracy, republicanism, secularism, socialism, nationalism, parliamentarianism. And again, Americans were fighting a single crown, and they're 3,000 miles from Europe. The French are in the belly of the beast. And it's not long before these monarchs see where this is going, and they want no part of it. They have to kill this in the womb. That's what they need to do. And in 1792, the Austrians and the Prussians in particular, with some of the Dutch, are going to invade France. And it looks like they're going to defeat the French. This is the summer of the fall of 1792. Yet again, there's an historical parallel here. If you recall, during the Russian Civil War, the Poles invaded Russia. They went through Ukraine. And they're slaughtering Jewish people by the bushel. A lot of people seem to forget this. But Trotsky organizes the Red Army and stops them at Kiev. The same thing happened here in France at a place called Valmy. The French army, now keep in mind, this is a conglomerate army. There are holdovers from the King's Army, mated up with Marquis de Lafayette's National Guard. You know what the National Guard was? This was not the King's Army. This was an army put together from the middle class to protect private property. That's what this is about. Yet, interestingly enough, thousands of French peasants grab a gun and march east to join this army to stop the Prussians and the Austrians at Valmy. This is a turning point in this war. This army, the monarch's army, looked like it was going to make it to Paris. They're stopped. just like the Poles are stopped at Kiev. Interesting the historical parallels that develop here. But the war will persist. So the French revolutionaries are not only subduing trying to subdue the French government and fight the nobility and royalty. Now they have to fight the monarchs from outside France. And here you're going to see here, interestingly enough, in August of 1793, there is a man by the name of Lazare Carnot. And Lazare Carnot was a 40-year-old mathematician on the Committee of Public Safety, this dozen that actually ran France. And they're affiliated with the Jacobin movement, of which Robespierre was part of. And so Carnot orders, and this is what he orders here, August 23, 1793. Get this, and this really hasn't happened before in the modern era. All unmarried men from 18 to 25 were to be drafted into battalions under banners reading, "The French people standing up to the tyrants." Soon, Paris was transformed into a throbbing arsenal. The gardens of the Tuileries and the Luxembourg were covered with shops producing, among other material, some 650 muskets a day. Unemployment vanished. Privately owned weapons, metal, surplus clothing were requisitioned. Thousands of mills were taken over. Capital as well as labor was conscripted. A loan of 1 billion livres was squeezed. Get this, squeezed from the well-to-do. You're taxing the rich. How would that go in this country today? Contractors were told what to produce. Prices were fixed by the government. Overnight, France became a totalitarian state. Copper, iron, saltpeter, potash, soda, sulfur, formerly dependent on imports, were now being found in and taken from the soil of France, blockaded on every frontier at every port. So and the scientists, they're all conscripted. And so you are seeing here France, and again, interestingly enough, this is a country at this point of 23, 24 million people, and they're going to have an army of 3.5 million men. The British have a population upwards of 12 million. Now they're going to have to conscript, and they're going to build an army of 750, 800,000 men. Russia, a population of 40 million. And they're going to have to conscript. This spreads like a plague. And so as these armies get bigger, the battles are getting bigger. In fact, you're going to see here, because of the French army, something else comes out: interchangeable parts on artillery pieces. If you're short building one caliber, maybe the parts of a caliber that you have in abundance, you can take the parts from that gun and bring it to the other and make more guns. This is where this is going. And interesting here, you are beginning to see this progression. The more factories you have, the more guns you can make. And financed by capitalism, technology, each new mark of weaponry is reaping an ever greater harvest of humanity. So you need what? Bodies. One feeds on the other. Now, this didn't happen in the United States during the American Revolution. 25,000 Americans died throwing the crown out of here. 25,000. In Europe, from 1792, there's two wars here. I call it the Great French War, but it's two chapters. 1792 to 1802, the French Revolutionary Wars. 1803 to 1815, the Napoleonic Wars. You know how many people died in this conflict? 23 and a half years. Try 6.5 million. This is your first taste of industrialized conflict. It's very rudimentary, but this is the germ from where this is going to sprout. And because, and they're not using the weapons you're going to see in the 20th century, 6.5 million dead, but it's Napoleon. You know, if you don't, and he persuades the people, if you don't want to be invaded, then we have to do what? Take over these countries and subdue them. And that's exactly what he's going to do with his Napoleonic wars. And the French people flock to this. They flock to this. It's fascinating what's developing here in France. It's absolutely astounding. And yet, interestingly enough, you know, I always remember here that there are, many people say that Napoleon lost this when he invaded Russia. There's a lot of truth to that. You know, he invaded Russia in 1812. Yet at the same time, look what he does here in Italy. He gets rid of the two Sicilies. The Papal States no longer exist. These will come back. And Napoleon, and you begin to see something here, the rise of nationalism in Italy. Italians now are beginning to feel like Italians. He puts together the Confederation of the Rhine. You know, he destroys the Holy Roman Empire. He changes the map of Europe. You know, the Holy Roman Empire lasted over 900 years. It no longer exists. He killed it. And so you begin to see this conglomeration of 16 German states as a buffer to what? Tsarist Russia. And when he invades Russia in 1812, out of 675,000 men in the Grand Army, 275,000 are French. Over 120,000 are Poles. Over 120, 140,000 are people from the German states. The Poles are interesting. They're joining Napoleon because they think they're going to get some territory back that they ain't going to get. That's not going to happen. But they make up this grand army. And so, but the other side of the coin here is, I am not totally convinced that Napoleon actually lost his empire in Russia, because Napoleon himself said in 1808, he invaded Spain. And when he invaded Spain, 300,000 Spanish people will join the insurgency. And in Spain, the French troops will occupy the cities and bases in between, but the guerrillas controlled the countryside. Guess who's going to win this in 5 years? It's not the French. If you remember, the beginning of the American Revolution didn't start as a revolution. It started as a civil war among the colonists. And as the British were pulling their troops out of the countryside and sticking them in the few American cities that existed, that's when the spontaneous upsurge began in the countryside. This is not an accident. In Vietnam, what did the French do? They occupied the cities. What did Ho Chi Minh do? Control the countryside. When the United States first went to Vietnam, they controlled the cities. What did Ho do down south? Control the countryside. You think this is an accident? It's not an accident. That's not an accident. And so Napoleon even admits one of the reasons for his collapse was the Spanish insurgency. And a little side note here of that, you know how many Americans today criticize the Islamic religion? Of course, they focus too much on this misuse of jihad. And that's, we're not into that today, but there's a misuse of that. But you know, if these jihadis, you know, if you die in a suicide truck bombing, let's say, there's 72 virgins waiting for you in heaven, that line to get people to do this. What do you think the Catholic priests and bishops were doing in Spain? Join the insurgency and your place is assured in heaven. What rubbish. And some people believe this stuff. Of course, we're talking about peasants that are not overly educated. But this war, what you saw in this war, is going to be food for thought down the road as we begin to see more in the way of professional armies. And you can see what's happening technologically. Ships are going to be weaned off being made by wood. And where are they going? Steel and iron. You see, in 1861, people here call this the American Civil War. I taught a course on this once. I call it the revolt of the planters. This was a revolution by the landed gentry of the South. I call them America's royalty. They're the equivalent, if you will, of the Russian boyar class to a certain extent. Their revolution was from the right, not the left. They are preserving their class. They're preserving their class distinction as the planter class. They're America's royalty. Yet, what's happening up north? The Hamiltonian notion of industrialization and finance, and that's going to win the war. That will win the war, not the Jeffersonian notion of the agrarian as the salt of the earth. And another little side note, you know who thought the farmer was the salt of the earth and catered to them quite heavily? The SS. If the SS was around today, they probably would have joined those Indians in the Dakotas to stop the pipeline. Shows you where they were. But anyway, you begin to see in the first part of the American Civil War, 1861, 1862, the North's not doing quite as well, are they? You would think so. Let's understand something. In 1860, the South produced 76,000 tons of steel. In the North, try 2,500,000 tons of steel. Who do you think's going to win an industrialized war here? In the South, you had 20,681 factories. Up north, over 110,000 factories. In the South, you had about 141,000 factory workers out of 5 million whites. Up north, try over 1,110,000 factory workers. So who's going to win this with what's going to be an industrialized war? A bunch of farmers or a bunch of wrench turners? It's not hard to figure this out, because after 1863, now that the northern economy has now have weaned itself off a peacetime economy, now onto a wartime economy. And who takes control of the Union Army? Ulysses S. Grant. Who does he have with him? General William Tecumseh Sherman. And this is where you see man's going. Attack the economy, not the battlefield, attack the economy. And so what do you see developing? And this is still studied in West Point. This is studied in England. This is in many military academies around the world still study this. It is going to be Ulysses S. Grant who will take on Lee's Army of Northern Virginia, but it's going to be Sherman who marches from the Mississippi clear across the South. And what is he doing? In a 60-mile wide path of destruction, railroad tracks, rip them up, rolling stock, blow them up, torch all the cotton bales, destroy the factories you come upon them, destroy resources. And the Southerners were now beginning to plant food instead of tobacco and cotton. You can't eat tobacco and cotton. And what does Sherman say? Sherman tells his cavalry, ride through the pastures and crush the crops, starve them out, famine. And so this is industrialized, corporatized, total war that you are seeing here, waged by the United States on its enemy, the Confederacy. And so, and I've taught this in my classes, that the only generation of Americans who really know total war, unless you talk to somebody who was at the Battle of the Bulge or on Iwo Jima, but the only Americans who really know total war are the Southerners of 1864, 1865, because they were on the receiving end of it. I don't think I have to tell you about the pictures, this new thing, photography, the damage that was wrought on the Southerners. The army is destroyed. Their government is dissolved. Their economy is a shambles. They are occupied. Their future, bleak. They are the only American generation to really understand total war. This is a prelude of what you're going to see in 1914. Because where has the Industrial Revolution gone by 1914? It's on steroids by comparison. Interesting, as the war begins, many of these countries thought the war might in 1914 the soldiers will be home by Christmas. Which one? Which one? And as this war gets out of control, Lenin, as this prophet, saying the war will not be over quickly. It will be an industrialized war, and it will be waged by the capitalist and fought by the working class. You know who else is saying the exact same thing? In 1911, 1912, I just gave a talk on this lady. 1913, 1916, Helen Keller, who was a socialist, who supported Lenin's revolution in 1917. I know, I have the 54-page FBI file on her. Yeah, Hoover had a file on Helen Keller. He couldn't deport her though, could he? That wouldn't have worked too well. But you are and by 1915, folks, at the Battle of Arras on the Western Front, keep in mind it's now trench warfare. And this shows you where this is going. The British, in 4 days, 96 hours, and Lenin is going to be proven right here, are losing over 3,700 men an hour in this inferno. Multiply that times 96. What are you going to get? This is where it's gone. And not only that, and this to me is a crux here. You are seeing, the British, the French, the Germans, they're all part of that European colonial imperialist clique. The Spanish, well, they're done. The Portuguese, they're done. The Dutch, forget them, they're done. The Belgians, out to lunch here, really. The only ones that really matter are the British, the French, and the Germans. Italy is coming on, but as Otto von Bismarck once said about Italian imperialist ambitions, strong appetite, but poor teeth. That's what they got. And he's right about that. But here, the three major competitors are being pushed into this war, really, of extermination. It's capitalist extermination, is really what you're seeing here. It's the capitalist devices of war that are really generating this huge loss. And yet, what else is happening? You're seeing two other powers join that group, Japan and the United States. But it's the United States that proves to be the wallet here. It's a power that's coming on. Do you know that the British at this time period, it doesn't sound like a lot of money today, they had $3.7 billion in investment assets and investments here. They're going to have to liquidate most of that, and they're down to 1.1 billion when this war is over with. The French have to liquidate 75% of their investments and assets here to pay. America, do you know this country? We get into the war late, so it doesn't impact us as much. Yet, this is changing the United States. You are beginning to see the government of the United States, grew 500% in this conflict? 500%. This government is going to spend, the American government will spend $22 billion in this war. And that's more than the entire country spent, get this, from 1791 to 1914. The war is going to cost the United States $2 million an hour. This never happened before. It never did. Where I am at Army Aviation Magazine, I was doing some research on Vietnam, the use of the helicopter in Vietnam, and I stumbled on an Army study, and I found that in 1968, remember the Tet Offensive? and 1969, do you know that war was costing this country 14 million bucks an hour, and it's a loser. Get that, 14 million bucks an hour, it's a loser. At least the $2 million an hour war was a winner. But here, America ingests, get this, America ingests $908 million of the world's gold. Why? Because of this industrialized conflict. You remember that company, DuPont? Remember that company? Yeah, DuPont. By the end of 1917, they're producing, get this, 40% of the Allies' munitions. That stock, get a load of this, that stock went from $20 a share in 1914 to $1,000 in 1918. Who's making the money here? Do you know, because of this war, big finance really gets a jolt here. I found this fascinating. JP Morgan, right? The Morgan interests, they were fronting the Allies a lot of money. Do you know they fronted them upwards of 2.7 billion, and they petitioned the Wilson government. We can't do anymore. Get this, the Morgans can't do this anymore. So what are they going to pass here? The Liberty Law. Now, what is that? That means when the Allies want more money and credits, guess who's going to have to foot the bill? The taxpayer. And by the time this conflict is over, if you want to say it's, well, the conflict in France was over. What we call World War, there is no World War I or World War II, folks. It's only one war. It's the Great War. 1914, not 1918, 1922. That's when the conflict ends. 1922, not 1918. What you saw with the armistice day in Versailles, that stopped the shooting in France. There's war going on all over the place. Eastern Europe, the Middle East, the British in Afghanistan until 1922. There's war still going on. But here, this country, by the time it's over, will have fronted the Allies over $11 billion, and we want it back. And so this is this big outward sign that the time is coming where Europe being the dominant political, military, social, and economic aspects of global power is coming to an end because of this war. 8.5 million men, soldiers, will die. 15 million died in this conflict. It's tragic. Yet, as we see, in 1931, the Japanese jumpstart the war, Manchuria. 1935, Mussolini invades Ethiopia or Abyssinia. 1936, Hitler violates the Versailles Treaty by occupying the Rhineland. In 1936, the Spanish Civil War starts, the tune-up for 1939. 1937, Japan invades China, and the beginning of an 8-year war that takes upwards of 15 million Chinese. 1938, Hitler absorbs Austria into the Reich in violation of the Versailles Treaty. In the fall of 1938, he's able to sliver off the Sudetenland because of 2.2 to 3 million German-speaking people, applies it to the Reich. In 1939, the spring, he'll dismember the rest of Czechoslovakia. He walks into Poland on September 1st, 1939, with Stalin's connivance, and then they're off and running again. Only this time, I found this fascinating. It turns again, it's an industrialized, corporatized, commercialized war. Navies are no longer on coal, they're on oil. The British are pumping it out of Persia. They're pumping it out of Iraq, a country they made. Iraq wasn't founded on its own. The British and the French drew the borders here. It's one of the reasons you got a problem in the Middle East now. And so here, the war again becomes an industrialized, corporatized war. Only here, Russia is not the Russia it once was. Now, let's understand this. When Stalin succeeded in being Lenin's heir, he did something here at the Party Congress in 1926. We are going to collectivize the peasant, whether they want to be collectivized or not. We're going to pinch some of his grain and his livestock. He's going to offshore some of that grain and livestock to raise hard currency. He's going to bring in American, British, and French engineers. He's going to start the factory system. And he's going to focus on heavy industry, not civilian goods, not light goods, heavy industry, machine tools, tractors. Why should Russia get that? Now he understands Stalin's no chump. Stalin knows in an industrialized war, you need oil. Russia is awash in it. Why should farmers and peasants be plowing their fields with horses and mules? Why should you be doing that? Can't you produce more food with tractors? Of course you can. So what does he do? Tractor factories. But what can you convert tractor factories into in time of war? Tanks. Ah, you see where he's going here? You see where he's going? He even says, we are going to accomplish in 25 years what it took the United States 100. And he doesn't give a damn how many people are going to starve to death here. I want what I want, end of discussion. Yet by 1941, Russia is second to the United States as the leading industrial power. See what he did? You can say whatever you want. People can say whatever they want about Stalin. From 1926 to 1949, he took a backward peasant economy to an atomic bomb in a generation. How many countries have done this? Not very many, as far as I know. Yet, and again, the industrialized war. Franklin D. Roosevelt, you know what Roosevelt said to journalists in 1940? I got this quote in my archives. He was asked about the war. You know, the war is only 4 months old. And he's asked, and he says, well, he said, the British are now in another war. And Britain has a lot of worldly investments and assets. And like in the last war, the last chapter of the war, they're going to have to liquidate a lot of these investments and assets to pay for the conflict. Wouldn't it be nice if we could ingest some of those investments and assets here? What is Franklin D. Roosevelt? You know, when I talk to my Democratic friends, they like to say he's a liberal. Eleanor was the liberal. Franklin D. Roosevelt was no liberal. I'll give you that he was eclectic enough to understand capitalism and what was needed to get the country out of the Depression. Government. I understand that. But the man, how many bankers and lawyers are liberals? You know, I mean, you gotta ask that question. So anyway, he said he's professing Pax Americana. Roosevelt is. And as this war goes on, and America, you know, it's actually after 1941. That's the turning point of the war. That's the turning point. And that turning point is Pearl Harbor and Moscow. And the reason that's the turning point, Hitler is stopped by the Red Army. 2 days later, the Japanese bomb Pearl Harbor. Now the world's #1 and #2 industrial powers, same side. And in January, they begin to take control of this conflict. And I'm going to tell you something about the Soviet industrial production. And they're not totally ramped up yet. In 1942, the Germans produced 5,997 tanks and assault guns. Do you know how much the Russians produced in that same year? 24,668 tanks.
So, Mark, Jessica just wrote on chat she has to leave soon. So why don't
I'm going to put an
we
amen to this.
take a break and allow her, if she wants to raise any questions before
Oh, sure.
she leaves. And let's take it from there. This is,
Sure.
I have a bunch of questions myself, but
I can finish it up with the questions too.
Yeah.
That's no problem. Sure, go ahead, Jessica.
Hi,
Good
I'm sorry.
afternoon.
Good afternoon. I'm so sorry. I wish I would have known before about this, and I would have made sure that I would have taken the whole day off. But yes, I have a question because we started out with the 30 Years' War.
Right.
And the question is, what caused the 30-year war? Was it, the fight for the enclosure movements that the ruling elite wanted to forcibly push the enclosures? What was the cause of the 30 Years' War? Because basically that's what happens in the English Civil War, is the fight against the enclosure movements, also the German peasant wars.
Right. And Frederick Engels wrote a book on the peasant wars in the German states, which I just downloaded that. Now I got it in my archives. But the fact of the matter is, yeah, that's true, but it's also religion. You know, Catholics, Protestants, that had come to a head here. But what is this really about? It's like the founders of this country understood this when they put this country together. Land is a determinant of power. It always was, still is, and always will be. And so you've got this attempt to control land, because land has what? Resources. Isn't that what Ukraine is about?
Right.
We haven't gotten off that merry-go-round yet, have we? And so, yes, besides land, to dominate the land, but also here it's religion too. It's being pushed, the Protestants against, and here you see in the German states, the washing of Catholics and Protestant sects. It's coming together here. You don't really see a lot. Well, yeah, you got the Huguenots in France, but France was overwhelmingly Catholic. That's not what you're seeing here in the German states. It's the same sort of thing you have in the Balkans, where Christianity and the Islamic religion meet because of the Ottoman Empire.
Mm-hmm.
And so here, you've got, and then as we go a little further east, you still have Catholics, but then you got the Eastern Orthodox. Isn't that some of what you're seeing with the Ukraine war right now? Some of these Ukrainians who are Eastern Orthodox don't like Catholic Poles. That doesn't seem to stop. And so you're seeing the same sort of thing here. Religion's considered what? One of the major reasons for starting a war? Haven't we seen that in history? Besides, and I think
I think that religion is used as a pretext for other things.
Of course it
the
is.
Civil War is a perfect example.
Of course it is. Of course it is. But land has always been, and it's one of the major causes of a war. In other words, if one side loses land, the other side wants it back. You don't think there aren't Germans that want East Prussia back? You don't think there aren't a few Mexicans coming across the southern border that don't want Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, California, Colorado, and Utah back? I mentioned that one night at a talk down here, and some lady in the back yelled out, well, you can give them Texas. So, this doesn't die. This doesn't die. And so, and even today, if you talk to a few Catholics and Protestants, oh, those goddamn Protestants or those goddamn Catholics. I mean, you still get that today. You still get that today. But a lot of that was part of the 30 Years' War. But coming out of that, you see that you begin some sober thinkers thinking we can't have another conflict like this, because it's not only the battle deaths, it's the famine that results. We need the peasants, and so they're gonna change how armies are gonna be formed, because they have to. You have to eat. You have to eat. So that's how they're going to change this. But again, fortunately, and Americans don't realize this, such a thing didn't happen here. A lot of Americans don't get this. They don't get this at all. They really don't. It's kind of irksome that they don't get this. Of course, they don't teach it either.
Look, Americans think that they're flying the little Ukrainian flags. They don't realize that there's a third world war. It's going to affect them. They think it's just going to affect the Europeans. It's going to be like World War II. They're going to have this post-war awesome period.
Well, I just gave a talk on Ukraine 2 weeks ago in Darien at a community center. And we got into this thing about Ukraine. And I said, you know what this is? This could be the beginning of a 10, 20, 30-year standoff. What do you mean 30 years? I said, It's a conflict between the United States neoliberal corporate capitalism, privatization of government agenda versus communist China's use of state capitalism and socialism. That's what you're seeing here. And the United States is going to fight this down to the last Ukrainian, and the Chinese are going to fight this down to the last Russian. I said, it's the great game. It's still being played. The resources, that's what matters. It could be for colonial India in the 18th century. Now it's Ukraine in the 21st.
Well, the issue is that we have a depression, and there's no way that the capitalist system can reset itself unless it gets rid of at least half the population. And that's what it's going to do. You destroy everything and then you rebuild, and there's lots of jobs.
Well,
But you have
yeah,
to
but,
destroy everything first.
but in the meantime, people who are, I'm not going to say innocent, because the human condition knows what's going on here and really does next to nothing to stop it.
No, people don't care. I mean, the war, the bombs in Syria, they couldn't care less. The kids starving in Yemen, they
Right.
don't care as long as they're eating.
Well, it goes back to another talk I was giving about and I responded to some of these things about, well, Americans say I made it on my own. I made it on my own. I said, really? I said, I remember as a kid, my father would go get gas. It was 27 cents a gallon. That's when America was the only game in town. I said, the dollar was the world's reserve currency. It is now, but for how long? How much is gas now? I know down where I am, it's $4.69.9. That shows the weakness of the dollar. America is no longer the only game in town. You've got all these kibitzers now in this club. The EU, Russia's in this club, China, and let's not forget India and Japan. You can't forget them either. Japan needs to beg, borrow, or steal energy wherever they can get it from. And so they're all in competition. And so people don't seem to understand. And I brought up the example of United Fruit, later Chiquita Banana. I said, you go to Stu Leonard's, there's a dairy store down here called Stu Leonard's. It's a big place. I said, you can go in here and buy bananas for 59, 69 cents a pound. Now, if the people in Guatemala and El Salvador had a more democratically oriented government and had more say in how the economy was run, do you honestly think you're going to be paying 59, 69 cents a pound for bananas? You're going to be paying what? 89 cents a pound, 99 cents, $1.09, $1.19, $1.29. I said, you think you made it on your own? You had a lot of help. Don't give me the stuff you made it on your own. That doesn't wash. That doesn't wash.
Maybe let me add a little bit to this, starting with your first question, Jessica. In terms of the 30 Years' War, what it reflected and what wars in general reflect are a crisis in a system. And what triggered the 30 Years' War was, on the one hand, crisis of feudalism and the rise of capitalism, extending to Sweden, where you had the genuine development of capitalism. And so you have a combination of the old system impelled into war by its crisis, and the wars are wars of plunder, combined with the new capitalist class, which takes the religious expression. So Luther and Protestantism was an early reflection of the rise of capitalism against Catholicism, which has, by this point, well over 1,000 years of association with feudalism. And the wars can open the path to a change in the new social system. So to jump ahead almost exactly 300 years, into the First World War, you have an unmistakable crisis of capitalism, a huge crisis in 1907, echoed by 1913-14 with additional crisis, and it impels capitalism into wars. And And to look at it in a broad historical viewpoint, and that's essentially what Lenin was doing, understood that the crisis of the old system could open the door to a new social system. And sure enough, you have the victory of a Russian Revolution. And sometimes I say, ironically, the weak link now in the world capitalist system, in my opinion, is Russia again. 105 years later, Russia and Ukraine. And I've had the real privilege I've been invited to China for more than 20 years, in part because the leadership there doesn't want a repeat of the Soviet collapse. And for all the external differences between China and the Soviet Union, China is the same kind of social system and with organization very similar to that of the Soviet Union. But in any event, in part at my request, I've had leaders in China invite members of the Communist Party in communist parties in former Soviet republics. And while many of them were nothing interesting about them, their youth came one year, and if they hadn't, they had integrated Lenin. They got expelled from the Communist Party of the Russian Federation, but nevertheless, that integration of Lenin was there. And you see something similar in Ukraine. And so that's where that possibility of how this war could end sooner in Ukraine is that possibility of a repeat of the Russian Revolution of 1917, extending now to Ukraine and to the Russian Federation and possibly beyond.
Well, you
So it
can
won't happen
see,
automatically.
you can see here though, what was, going back to the 30 Years' War culminates in 1918, 1919. You're talking about royal family, some of the royal families and nobility that existed, that even the structure of this existed when people were tied to the land as serfs. That no longer exists. These monarchs are trying to exist in a system where you now have the bourgeoisie accumulating the wealth, and by comparison, they're not. You now have a middle class which are not tied to the land. Some of these people make a few bucks, they can float. So how are they supposed to keep a handle on these people? They can't. And so when they finally, they're dinosaurs, they're out of their element. And there's gonna be this extinction. I mean, the Romanovs are gonna be gone, the Hohenzollerns will be gone, the Ottoman Empire, gone, the Habsburgs, gone. But what replaces them? Bolshevism, fascism, Nazism. And that's where it goes. And so you're in this tumultuous period of change, and it undermines also Britain and France. And by 1945, when this is over with, the European colonial powers, they're done. Their dominance is finished. They no longer can exist as the top flight powers in this new era. And it's a new balance of power. It's the United States and the Soviet Union, and we call it the Cold War. But that's the new balance of power.
That's right. And
it's over for the Europeans. It's over.
In any case, I didn't see which came first, but Yusuf and Alan had their hands up, whichever of you came first. But once you raise your questions and comments, And again, this is extremely important. And there's one thing about military history is you're forced to face the facts. Isn't that right, Mark?
Oh, yeah. And there are people who don't want to face the facts.
That's right. Oh, yes. You know, so was it Alan? Did you have your hand up first?
Oh, Yusuf had his hand up first.
Thank you. I have a reputation with excellent talk. However, I'll remain true to my reputation for nitpicking. What's said about Iraq is not, it's quite a bit of an exaggeration. I mean, all countries have some diversity. United States has great diversity. There's the North and the South, the East and the West, the Midwest, and so on and so forth. But I mean, in Arabic sources going back as far as we know, that's like some 1,400 years, you have the mention of Iraq as a region. And it's separated by a desert from Greater Syria, which was called the Sham. And it was known during Ottoman times as a, you know, I mean, it was divided into 3 provinces, but it was known collectively as Iraq. And maybe sometime I could discuss that further with you. As I might have mentioned, I have a family in Baghdad, and they frequently visited us in, well, my summer home, my paternal grandmother's home, and we had a lawyer who gave much of the political gossip and history of Iraq. So anyway, what happened is that the great powers manipulated the excellent differences by giving favor to one group over another, and especially after the U.S. occupation, this was put on steroids. And mind you, the Shia of Iraq in the south fought against Iran when Iran invaded. Of course, it was an unjust war to begin with, but when push came to shove, their loyalty was with Iraq and not with the sectarian. So anyway, I could discuss that with you later.
Well, just to elaborate just a little bit, yeah. But as modern nations, they didn't exist.
Oh, sure, yeah.
And that's the point here. It's the British and the French with the beginning with the Sykes-Picot Agreement that drew the borders through clannish associations, tribal affiliations, religious differences, and ethnic passions. And you don't think you're not going to have a problem here? This is Western induced. The only real country that grew by itself, and this is something they have in common with us. We formed this country. The Americans formed this country after they threw the British out. The only people in really in the Middle East, the only people that really formed their own, Arabs, that is Saudi Arabia. The only one. The others were done by the British. I'm talking in the modern era here, because when the Ottomans had this area, they were all in administrative districts. But now the Europeans come along, and this figures they screwed it up because they wanted this area when the Ottomans collapsed because of the resources. Here we go again with that. And the people, they don't matter. They don't matter. Just like Afghans didn't matter, just like Ukrainians don't matter, just like El Salvadorans don't matter, Guatemalans don't matter. The big powers, all they want is what they want. And we can't seem to get off this merry. And I found it interesting too, because when this year is going to be the 90th anniversary of Iraq admitted into the League of Nations, October 2022. It's 90
Well,
years ago.
Well, July 14th was the Republican Revolution in Iraq, and actually that Qasem, for all his faults, constituted Iraq as a nation, not as a sectarian,
Correct.
not along sectarian lines.
Correct.
Anyway, we could
But
discuss that later.
supposedly, as a sovereign kingdom of Iraq, it was supposed to, the British said it's now a sovereign kingdom in 1932. That's a lot of bunk. They still controlled it.
Yeah. Yeah, anyway, we could discuss that later. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you, Yusuf. Yes, Alan. You're on deck, I guess.
Yeah, to comment on the earlier comment that one possibility in the Russian-Ukrainian crisis would be a social revolution is actually quite feasible. There are a lot of reports about Russian troops deserting, mutinying. Today I heard that a lot of them are stripping the tanks and the other weapons before it gets to the front. The social unrest in the major cities of Russia, and even some of the smaller districts. So it is quite possible there might be a second Soviet state. I mean, it's a possibility.
Nothing's impossible, is it?
Well, you know, Lenin said that Russia was the weakest link in the capitalist chain, and it still is again.
Well, yeah, that's what Stalin understood. He knew that Stalin knew in 1914 that Russia was the least industrialized, least organized, least prepared for the war. They were still, their military, Alan, was still being rebuilt or remodeled after the 1945 Russo-Japanese War defeat. They're still, and so, you know, when the countries, these, like when England, France, and Germany mobilized in 1914, Germany really wasn't concerned about Russia right away because the rail system is not like Germany's, and the country is huge. Now, how long it's going to take to generate all these guys into an efficient army? Yet the Russian, well, let's understand something about the Russians. They did it faster than the Germans thought.
Yeah.
They did. But Stalin understood that the next war is going to be, and he knew there was another war coming. Stalin's not stupid. He knew there was another war coming, and he's going to be ready for it. That's what he tried to do. And that's where he's going to go with this. That's where he's going to go with this. And guess what? In the end, I tell people in talks that I give on the Eastern Front, I said, the tank producing combine of the world was not Detroit. It was Chelyabinsk in the Soviet Union. They produced upwards of 121,000 tanks during the war. America produced 102,000. That's not chopped liver either. But when you add Soviet armor and American armor, you think the Germans, Japanese, and Italians can compete? No, they can't. So they're going to lose. That's just one aspect of this. But Stalin knew what he was doing.
Yeah, the Second World War, they could not have been won without the Russians.
They
had
won
the
the land
numbers,
war.
they had the weapons, they had everything that was needed to win the war.
Well, again, American, because I taught a course one time on the Great Patriotic War, and I stressed to my students that I said the Soviets win the land war. This allows the United States to do everything else, but the Soviets win the land war. And I said the greatest battles in the European theater were fought on the Eastern Front. Where on the Western Front you had thousands of men and hundreds of tanks. In some of the battles on the Eastern Front, millions of men and thousands of tanks. And the Germans are going to get eaten alive here. Soviet steamroller.
And the Germans lack the oil to get these tanks moving.
Right. We're back to that. In fact, my wife asked me one time some years ago, she says, what is your most vivid recollection of Valentine's Day? Thinking I'm going to say something romantic here. And I told her, I said, well, when Abdulaziz Ibn Saud and Franklin D. Roosevelt aboard the heavy cruiser Quincy off Bitter Lakes, Egypt, consummated the deal. U.S. military protection for the kingdom versus preferential access to Saudi crude. And every president, be he Democrat or Republican, has catered to that agenda ever since. Welcome to the Middle East. You are now the caretaker of the British Empire. And all I got was, boy, what a real romantic you are. Well, you asked. But that's true. Oil. So without oil, you can't have an industrialized war. You're done. Fascinating.
And yet the huge question is that Soviet army disintegrates in Afghanistan in the 1980s. There was a whole problem, what I've spent much of the past decades trying to understand, but that Soviet army disintegrates in Afghanistan. And so we have to think that through. And so it was sworn to defend socialism. And by the late 1980s, it's unmistakable with the fall of the Berlin Wall and with what's unfolding in Romania, in Poland, that socialism is under mortal danger, and that Soviet army sworn to defend socialism cannot even defend it at home. So this is one of the great and most important puzzles that we face. And again, that's what I've spent most of the past 20 years on.
Yeah, I've done the same thing, Wadi. I've done the same thing up at Army Aviation Magazine, because I'm writing a book on the history of Army Aviation. And I'm right now working on the chapter on Afghanistan. And the first chapter is the Soviets in Afghanistan. The second part of the chapter I'm working on now is the United States in Afghanistan.
And if you can send me any material that you've done, but I've organized seminars in China. What happened to the Soviet army?
Well, you know, one thing I got into the National Archives, the intelligence archives, and I printed out some stuff. And when the war was over, CIA debriefers were debriefing some of the Mujahideen officers, they considered officers. And one guy in particular stands out. He was called Colonel Belloc. I don't think that's his real name, but Colonel Belloc. And this one CIA officer says, well, you know, how come you guys won? The Russians had the tanks, the planes, the guns, so on and so forth. And you know what he said? You know what his answer was? We were willing to fight to the last man. They weren't. That's the answer.
That's a huge factor. And this is where my question is going. I can certainly understand, and again, been a huge fan for a long time of the new model army. And you may have raised it, but was there an equivalent? What was the French Revolution's equivalent of a new model army before effectively the right turn in the French Revolution in 1793? But was there a French equivalent of a new model army?
Yeah, you could see it coming here in 1797, 1798, 1799. I mean, the French
have a name?
Well, no, it's the French army, but it's along the same lines. The French army, when Louis XVI, just before his fall, he had about 110,000 men in it, and they all wore white uniforms. The militia types or the adjunct force had blue uniforms, and they were about maybe 30, 40,000. They were used mainly to keep order. But when the revolution starts, Marquis de Lafayette helped form the National Guard, which is a middle-class army to protect private property. Later on, the Federate are going to be formed, and these are maybe working class peasants, and they're all going to be fighting the invaders. besides fighting royalty and nobility. But by
What's the name? Federer?
Federer, right. But by 1797, 1798, you know, Napoleon is becoming a name even here after his Italian campaign. And he's even going to be, he's looked upon like Marshal, the General Ney, people like this. And this army is becoming more and more professional to the extent elements of the Federer, elements of the National Guard, even people that could be included from the old Royal Army are now put into this army that now is battle worthy. It's battle tested. It's been well blooded, and they are a well drilled army. And Napoleon is moving up in the, even before he's dictator, is becoming a power player here by 1799, 1800. And he's going to take control of this army. You saw the same sort of thing happen here, and I intimated it earlier, but didn't go into detail, with the American Civil War. You know, the founders did not want a large standing army here. That's why they put together the militia system. That's why they did that. They thought a large standing army was a threat to the Republic, and we don't want that. The founders didn't want an officer class because they knew what that meant. And so, but in 1861, 65, by the time the war is over, the Union Army, get this, will be 2,213,000 men. And it's a modern professional style of army. Now, it's the largest armed force in the history of North America up to this point. But what happens here? There were still many in Congress after the war who were still, you know, acting along the lines of the founding of this country. And in 2 years, the army will be down to 57,000 men. And by that 1876, 26,000. They got rid of it because they thought it was a threat to the country. That's not the same type of congressman that exists after 1918, and especially after 1945. Not the same kind of people are being elected to Congress.
Well, just about exactly a year ago, we had a great speaker on what happened in Tulsa in 1921.
Oh yeah, Black Wall Street.
But Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz. In any case, she has quite a book on the origin of the militia in North America and of the Second Amendment.
Right.
And it's a mighty piece of history. So where did the right to bear arms, in fact, often obligation to bear arms, and what were the militias about? So it was basically the nascent U.S. ruling class arming its social base, people that it had granted land to, in other words, settlers, to be used against Native Americans, against the indigenous peoples. That's where the right to bear arms, and the rise of the militias came from. It's an extraordinary piece of work.
Yes,
now,
it is.
A lot has changed since then, but
Yes, it is.
highly recommended. And I'm thinking of inviting her. She has another book called Not a Nation of Immigrants that differentiates between everybody who's in North America. So clearly, when we're talking about the indigenous peoples, we're not talking about what we think of as immigrants. Clearly, with people who were brought here chained and enslaved, that's not the immigrants we're talking about.
Right.
But a huge part of the equation is that the southern half of the United States had been the northern half of Mexico and seized in wars.
Right.
And often used term by the Chicano movement is the border crossed us.
Right.
So in
Yeah,
any
yeah.
event, in terms of developing a movement that will end the system of capitalism in the United States, awareness of who's who, and not least, I think Chicanos are more than 40 million in the United States.
Well, you know what, you know what you want to do sometime when you get somebody complaining to you about immigrants coming across the border, you know, illegal immigrants, you tell them, well, how do you think we got Texas? Illegal immigration.
That's right.
Well,
That's
how the U.S. was, the Americas were settled. I mean, they didn't exactly get visas from the native population.
No, I've never seen a Mohawk visa.
My wife says we, you know, the people living here should have built the wall in 1491, but that's past. But in any event, a question and really quite a discussion is on the term American Revolution.
Right.
Because what happened here in terms of the victory over the British certainly was not, and you raised this, not a victory, say, of capitalism against feudalism. Because Britain had its bourgeois revolution in the 1640s. And there's that puzzle of why would so many indigenous peoples and enslaved people fight on the side of a crown.
Right.
And so that I personally reject the term American Revolution for, at best, war of independence. So again, it's really a war between thieves. Sometimes, you know, so Britain was ready to, and I'm taking this from Gerald Horne, provide nominal independence for Rhodesia. And the white Rhodesian farmers did not think that was such a good idea. And they went into revolt against Britain on this. And so that's a rough parallel, not exact, but nevertheless, a rough parallel between settlers here and the young U.S. ruling class, and its contradictions with Britain.
Well, it is a revolution from the perspective that they're destroying the crown's political hold on this entity. However, having said that, yes, the unanimous declaration of the 13 United States of America is a profession of faith. It's a profession of independence. It's the document that came out the year before that they don't seem to want to talk about that matters here. And that was the causes and necessity of taking up arms. And I was talking about this document yesterday. If you read this document, it came out the year before. And in this document, it says at the end, we have now taken up arms and we are not going to put them down till the reasons for same are over. That's your declaration of war. What the following year is a profession of independence and profession of faith. This one here is a declaration of war. They're telling them, we are now picking up our guns. We're no longer going to petition the king. We are no longer going to petition parliament. Forget writing letters to the editor. The time has come to pick up a gun and start shooting your fellow man. And that's the course they're going to take. And for how it ended up, that was probably the correct course to take.
I have a funny story to tell you, recounted to me, and it holds up by the president of UE. So everybody here has heard of the Boston Tea Party, right?
Yeah.
And dumping tea into Boston Harbor. And the story we hear is that it was a rebellion against the British having imposed tariffs on tea.
Right.
The real story provided me by this union leader, yes, the British had imposed taxes and tariffs on tea. Well, what that did was to open the door for smugglers who
Right.
got quite rich by smuggling tea in.
Yes, sir.
And recognizing that the tariff on tea was not an effective way of actually raising funds for the British Army here, the king withdrew the taxes. And the Tea Party was actually smugglers throwing tea in protest into Boston Harbor because the tariffs on tea had been dropped. It meant ruination for them. It's not the story we hear.
Well, no,
Anyway.
part of it was too, that the tea was brought in by the British East India Company. And Americans, and quite a while into the 19th century, will dislike large corporations because they thought it was a threat to the Republic. That's when Americans, that to a certain extent, had their heads screwed on right. And they not only did that in Boston, they did this in Baltimore, and they did it in Philadelphia too. But that brings up another point. And one other major reason that this revolution will succeed, this bout for independence will succeed, is in 1763. The British East India Company, which is the corporate leadership of what's going to happen in India, takes a look at a map. You know, that thing, geography, that Americans don't do too well with anymore. And they took a look at the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. And the last thing they want is some interloper, meaning Tsarist Russia, going down those two rivers into the Persian Gulf through the Strait of Hormuz. And there you are in the Arabian Sea, and there's colonial India. So what do they start doing? In 1763, they begin to move their Indian empire west into the Middle East. And in 1863, they opened up an office in Basra. 5 years later, the British government will open a consulate here. In 1763, 1768. In 1798, the British East India Company will open an office in Baghdad, followed 4 years later by a British consulate here. You see what's going on here? The British do not trust the Ottomans. Now are beginning to totter here. They don't think the Ottomans are that prescribed buffer against Tsarist Russia. They need to be, let's use the term, motivated. And so as the British are moving more and more into the Middle East, how are they going to send a lot of troops here to fight the colonists? Americans don't realize that what's going on in the Middle East right now helps the growth and development of the United States, especially in the 19th century. We don't teach that here. We don't teach this at all. And so what's happening in this place that's going to be known as Iraq is off the radar screen an element that determines what's going to happen in North America. And we don't teach this. We don't take a look at a geography and a map and say, gee, this is what's going on here. Geography tells you a lot. It really does. So when you put all these pieces together, there's a lot of moving pieces going on here between the colonial powers, between this thing that's going to be known as the United States. And so I find this fascinating that this is generally left out of the mix.
Well, that's certainly why, one, we appreciate military history and appreciate Marxism above all, because of the capacity to face the truth and to change it and to change reality. And many people don't realize that apparently around half of all of Engels' work is devoted to military questions,
Right,
with incredible attention to the slightest details in terms of training, in terms
Right.
of organization of forces and strategy. And you see a prediction by Engels 40 years before World War One that's extraordinarily accurate in terms of describing what the war will likely
That's
look like.
correct. You know, it's
So,
fascinating too, when you take a look at somebody like an Engels, Abraham Lincoln was more knowledgeable on military affairs than you think. When he knew we were going to war, he went to the Library of Congress and got all the war treatises. And he sat down and read and studied them. So by 1862, 63, when these generals are telling, he knows what's going on. You know who another one was? Who was even though he was never really a soldier, but had good aptitude for the military? Leon Trotsky.
oh, I mean,
Trotsky.
he had, you know, been a journalist and a student of the Balkan Wars
Right.
and learned an enormous amount.
Yeah.
And so this is again part of the understanding what happened with the Soviet Union, and the big difference between the
Right.
Soviet Union and China is at the start of 1917, the year of revolution, the Bolshevik Party had just 8,000 active members, had 24,000 on the books, 8,000 active members, and no army.
Right.
By November 7th of that year, they're in power. And all of a sudden, if the new state is going to be defended, it needs an army.
Right.
And so again, an extraordinary feat to organize the Red Army and to organize victory, not only against the landlords and of Russia and exploiters of Russia, but against imperialist armies, no shortage of which, including the United States, despite Ronald Reagan's failing memory, invaded to try to help destroy the new Soviet state. To organize an army, I mean, there's a lot of skills involved, both technical skills and in terms of organizing the army itself and the people, and to do that, and I always knew this, but then realized the scope of it. The new Red Army brings in something like 300,000 officers from the Tsarist army. The number is astonishing.
Yeah.
But of course, so to protect, because essentially they were indoctrinated in capitalist ways of doing things. So to protect as best they could against a bourgeois way of doing things, essentially the Soviet leadership brings in commissars, and they played such an important role, not only in the Civil War starting in 1918, but nevertheless, again, very huge part of the Red Army are former Tsarist officers.
Right.
Let's take it on another scale. So again, if they wanted to avoid counter-revolution by military means, they had to organize an army.
Correct.
And it's extraordinary.
It is.
Organize to avoid counter-revolution a much worse fate, which is for the new Soviet state to be overthrown by its own base, social base, meaning workers and peasants. Essentially, you had to, so organizing the economy, because people now expected to eat. People now expected housing. Essentially, you see the Bolshevik party getting absorbed by the petty bourgeoisie, by intellectuals, by former managers. And you can understand how that would happen. But then
Right.
you have a million decisions getting made every day where, considering again how tiny the Bolshevik Party was, inevitably you see the rising domination of, to use, of the middle class over the working class. And so, to cite just one example, in 1927, basically the Soviet government advises the Communist Party in China to subordinate itself to the Kuomintang. And you, at the
Right.
time, you have a tremendous rise of working class struggle, and also of that crucial bourgeois democratic struggle of the peasantry for land reform and
Right.
national liberation. And to subordinate this struggle to the bourgeois nationalists of the Kuomintang assured a near fatal defeat for the Communist Party. Luckily, it was not defeated, and it had to learn to think for itself. It trusted the Soviet leadership on that advice, but after that, they had to learn to think. And what develops in China in the decades after, from 1927 to the victory of a revolution, is extraordinary, and a huge difference then between the Russian Revolution, this extraordinary achievement, and the Chinese Revolution is one, the Chinese Communist Party had more than, somewhat more than 1 million members at the start of 1949, which is still small. They had about a population of 400 million, but nevertheless, 1 million is a whole lot better than 8,000.
Well, it's like Michael Borden, when he was assigned to assist the Chinese Communist Party, he
Right.
urged them toward the proletarian revolution. And Mao was one who said, how many factory workers we got here? Peasants we got. And who's
Right.
going to follow him? Ho Chi Minh. Peasants we got.
Thank you.
So it'd be based on a peasant revolution. That's
So,
the right way to go.
Except it's led by a Communist Party, and it's
Right.
unmistakably working class. Unmistakable. You read like Mao on democratic revolution, and
Hmm,
it's unmistakably working class, providing direction to the peasantry.
right.
And one of the great experiences I've had in China was my host taking me. It was called the Tunnel War Village, to defend against the Japanese, and really that starts in 1931 and really
Right.
escalates in 37. So talk about one single war from
Yep.
14 until into the early 50s. So we go into a working village. They're actually, this is in the year 2000, they're threshing wheat by hand
Huh,
in the center of the village. And there's speakers making announcements for the entire village while we're there. But we walk into this hut that's been preserved from the Tunnel War. So the Tunnel War, to protect against the Japanese, basically the Chinese army dug up, is mainly the peasantry, digs up something like 17,000 miles of tunnels. And the Japanese soldiers were afraid to go into the tunnels, and so they would drop chemical bombs in there.
yeah.
And so what they learned to do then was to dig a second level. And this was a case in the where I went. Not only did we descend to the first, but there was a second level that was sealed. We dropped down to the second, and it was like the size of a, let's say, very large living room, maybe 20 feet by 40 feet. And in it were two sophisticated pieces, simple but sophisticated pieces of machinery, one to produce ammunition for the war, and the other was to produce clothing for the army.
Yeah.
One, no peasant could have built machinery like that.
Yeah.
These were workers who had worked in factories, who had either carried or rebuilt the machines down there. So again, you see the leadership of the working class. Second is that another difference between the Russian Revolution and the Chinese is that they fought the Civil War before the victory of a revolution. So unlike Russia, at the time of victory, October 1, 1949, you have not only a much larger and battle-hardened party, but you have an extraordinary battle-hardened army.
Right.
And so this is a huge difference between the Chinese and Russian revolutions. And that's part of a reason for my cautious optimism about China, combined with the fact that they were shocked by the collapse of the Soviet Union. That's the main reason that they've put up with me for 20 some years, is they don't want that repeat. And I had spent many years studying what had happened in Hungary 56, Czechoslovakia 68,
Right.
in Poland 1980, as well as the fall of the Soviet Union and 11 other states like it. And but what I came to realize after the first invitation is who was inviting me. While they're part of top leadership, not the absolute very top, but top leadership of China,
Right.
they represent the party side of what's party and government that's entwined. Now, the government of necessity has to include, as was the case with Russia in 1917, all the classes involved in organizing the army, all the classes involved in organizing the economy. And that meant domination of the petty bourgeoisie or middle class that's in part afraid of revolution, that's in part afraid of the working class. And so, like that building in Florida that suddenly collapsed June, a little more than a year ago,
Right.
if you look at it, a million bad decisions had been made from siting the building. You really shouldn't build, high towers on sandbars, especially if the oceans are rising. But then with the architecture, those who have studied it found flaws with the architecture of a building. And then in the process of construction, to save money, for example, the construction company reduced how many rebars were used, which, and that's not uncommon in building buildings, except that you're asking for trouble on a building that's going to come under the stresses. And then problems with inspection of a building as it was built, allowing, too few rebars to have been put up. And then a million errors and neglect in terms of maintenance of a building. And so, to cite just one example, apparently the sloping of the waterproofing above the swimming pool was incorrect. And as a result, basically water was leaking in and compromising foundations that were inadequate. And then you have the rising oceans, the typhoons coming in.
Yeah, that'll do it.
And one day, this building just collapses. And with the Soviet Union, we can understand, again, considering how backward Russia was and how tiny that Bolshevik party was, how a million decisions could be made, including, for example, that bad advice to China in 1927. You can imagine if successful revolution in China, if revolution had been successful in China, say in 1928 or 29 or 30, how much that would have weakened world imperialism and strengthened the Soviet Union. Or for that matter, if revolution had been successful in Iran, which had in 1979, which had 1,000 miles of border with the Soviet Union, and Iranian workers formed Soviets. But again, this leadership is afraid of revolution and afraid of struggle and afraid of a working class. And that also can be seen internally with the army and internally with trade union policies. And so, like that building, you see a million decisions that weaken the building. And then along comes typhoons. In the case of the Soviet Union, massive economic crisis around the capitalist world, not in the United States, but through the 1980s. And the typhoon stresses the building and that building collapses. It's astonishing.
I don't know. Thomas Jefferson once said, you know, an occasional revolution is healthy. Get rid of the dead wood.
So yes, it is. Yes, it is. So in any event, we, you know, we're past our deadline for today. We're so grateful for this presentation, Mark. Again, facing reality.
Oh, it's a lot of fun.
And there's 1,000 additional questions that come up. So we hope we can have you back again with Zach's picture while he's away or with his camera off. You see the Center for Marxist Education.
Right.
I'm here.
Yeah, you're there. So the center, after almost 50 years, and it's in the same location, we had to vacate last year, in part
really?
because of the. So we're hoping to find a new physical space, but the pandemic did a job on us. But the new landlord did a job on us, and gentrification in what was the most integrated working class area in all of Boston, Central Square in Cambridge. Nevertheless, especially on one side of it towards MIT, there's been a lot of gentrification.
Yeah.
But in any case, we're hoping to, as soon as rents drop again, as soon as landlords forget their dreams of charging absolutely outrageous rents,
Yeah.
because small businesses are taking a beating. So we're hoping to reopen a new space. And Mark, we again want to thank you, and we hope to have you again, and
Sure.
and to open up the new space in the coming, hopefully, year. Although this pandemic is far from over, and who knows when a far more serious variant or really strain of a virus might show up. It's almost inevitable. So
Well, as long as it's got a host to feed on, you know.
oh, you bet. And the massive inequalities on Earth basically assure that human hosts will continue.
That's right.
So many of the new variants apparently are generated in people who are immunocompromised.
Yep.
Not so much as to be killed by the virus, but allowing the virus basically to replicate and replicate with new.
Yep.
But every little friendly Bambi and deer and mink and quite a few animals are hosting this virus.
That's
and,
right.
This is unfortunately was all too predictable, and reflects again the general failures of the old system. And what we're about is bringing an end to this, and So again, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Zach, really for
You're
all
welcome.
organizing. Yep. And do we have another event planned that you know of?
Not that I know of.
But we're hoping to have a film soon again. And I'm hoping maybe to invite Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, possibly to speak about the Second Amendment or about Not a Nation of Immigrants. And both books of hers highly recommended. Also, Indigenous People's History of the United States. But look for the book Loaded or the book Not a Nation of Immigrants, especially the latter in terms of identifying some of the latent contradictions within the United States and how they could open the door essentially for the transition from capitalism here to working class power. And this, Chicano question is huge. The most explosive is the Black question, but the Chicano question is huge.
Yeah.
Especially considering what people in Mexico and south of Mexico are suffering. So thank you, everybody. We hope to see
Thank
you
you.
again. Yep. And what a discussion. Yep. Thank you.
Have yourselves
Thank
a
you.
nice weekend.
And Yusuf, thank you for finding this Mark. I don't know what planet he came from, but thank you.
Thank you.
Marco
yourself-
Pasha.